Donkey Kong has one of the strangest stories in Nintendo history. It only came to be because of a variety of fluke factors, including a previous failed game, a genius in waiting in Shigeru Miyamoto, a Popeye game that didn't work, and Nintendo crushing Universal Studios in a bad faith lawsuit. From that strange set of circumstances was born a massive hit. As you'll soon learn, the game has gone on multiple extended hiatuses, and is just coming off of one now. Let's start where the last video left off. Donkey Kong 3 was a strange game. It broke away from the previous mold of Donkey Kong games and brought in a new character, Stanley the Bugman, turning the game into a decidedly odd shooter. Donkey Kong Jr. Math was a bad remake of Donkey Kong Jr., and the franchise now had multiple oddities in a row. Donkey Kong Jr. Math was released in North America in October 1985, and then nothing. No, seriously, nothing. That was it for the franchise for 9 years. Now that's not for lack of trying. In fact, there were at least 3 separate efforts to bring back Donkey Kong before 1994, all of which failed. In 1987, Nintendo Publications teased Return of Donkey Kong, describing it as a game that would allow you to play with more, quote, barrel-tossing fun, end quote. Short of these 2 very brief teasers, nothing is really known about this game, and no one really has any idea about what they would have looked like. No testing information, images, or game builds were ever released. The prospect of a Donkey Kong game on an entirely new platform, the Philips CDI, nearly came to reality in the early 90s. Philips was given the right to develop games for some of Nintendo's most prestigious franchises, including Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong. The Mario and Zelda games were infamous as some of the worst ever made for both franchises, and Donkey Kong came a little too close to joining that club, with Rydell Software Productions being given the chance to design a Donkey Kong game during this time period. Interviews conducted by Time Extension confirmed that such a project was, at some point, in the works. However, again, there's no physical evidence about what that game would have been. Then there's this weird one. According to Stephen Radosh, who worked for Sega in the late 1980s, Sega managed to obtain the license to Donkey Kong and was creating a game that centered around Donkey Kong playing as a parking attendant? According to an interview with Radosh in 2016, quote, "You were dodging cars that were pulling in and out of the lot, and you had to get X number of cars parked in spaces," end quote. However, Sega was sold, and the game never released. In 1991, Donkey Kong was at its 10th year anniversary. Shigeru Miyamoto, who had first developed the franchise, began to talk to Nintendo about how to develop a brand new game in honor of the anniversary. That was meant to be a new game, not a remake, and imagined as a re-envisioning of the original game. Unfortunately, it never came together. Unable to get a game out the door to meet the anniversary deadline, Donkey Kong fans had to settle for having Donkey Kong Jr. be a playable character in Mario Kart. However, the conversations did, finally, lead to the release of the first new Donkey Kong game. That game, Donkey Kong, was a puzzle platform game for the Game Boy. It came with a variety of new features, including updated character designs, the use of new items like keys, backflipping with Mario, and more. The game received high critical praise and won the Game Boy Game of the Year award from Electronics Gaming Monthly in 1994. It is available today on the Nintendo Switch Online. Of course, 1994 is much better known for a very different Donkey Kong game. The story behind Donkey Kong Country begins in a place not usually known for their video game activity, England, and specifically Twycross. There was Rare, a game development company created by Tim and Chris Stamper. The company had produced a series of well-known Nintendo games, including Wizards & Warriors, RC Pro-Am, and, my personal favorite, Marble Madness. In 1992, Rare purchased Silicon Graphics, which produced computing hardware and software. Armed with brand new technology, Rare was now well-positioned to create what essentially amounted to 24-bit graphics that could run on the 16-bit Super Nintendo. This would allow them to create revolutionary new game for the SNES, using their new technology to create 3D-like graphics. The timing here was perfect. In the early 90s, Sega was eating massive chunks out of Nintendo's market share. Aladdin for the Genesis, released in October 1993, took the highly popular Disney movie and made it into an exciting and visually appealing platformer. Nintendo needed an answer. Howard Lincoln, now chairman of Nintendo, heard about Rare's potential new graphics and was extremely impressed with what he saw. Multiple Nintendo staff felt the same and traveled to Rare's English headquarters to get a demonstration. Once they saw it, they loved it, and a new game using that technology was on shortly after. Inspired by the success of Mortal Kombat, Tim Stamper suggested creating a new game using pre-rendered graphics. In a nutshell, pre-rendered graphics involve taking video footage, recording it, and then using it at the right moment. These graphics are not rendered in real time, allowing developers to use graphics that can be more complex than what would otherwise be available on the hardware. Pre-rendered graphics have been around since the early 80s, but this new game would be the first to make extensive use of these graphics in a home console. Numerous versions exist on how Nintendo ultimately came to give Donkey Kong to Rare. On the one hand, the franchise hadn't really been a hit since the early 80s, and that meant that even if the game went wrong, it couldn't really damage any other existing and active intellectual property. As such, Rare may have selected the property from a catalog of games offered to them by Nintendo, or Nintendo had offered Rare Donkey Kong. Shigeru Miyamoto says that Rare specifically requested the game. However it happened, this much is clear. Rare was set to develop a new Donkey Kong game. Development began in mid-1993 with 12 programmers, the most Rare had ever used, working on the game. The team worked to develop the new game by drawing sequences and various set pieces on post-it notes, then arranging them for programming. Not everyone was happy with the product that Rare was creating. Nintendo staff had some concerns about the quality of the game, with Gunpei Yokoi apparently saying that he was worried that the game looked, quote, too 3D, end quote. This was the first Donkey Kong game that Shigeru Miyamoto was not directly involved in working on, although he consulted heavily on the game development, and he approved of the direction that the pre-rendered graphics were taking the property. By the time the game was done, more than 20 people had worked on the game, costing Rare $1 million, and taking 22 man-years of time invested into the 18-month development cycle. The Stampers reported that programmers worked 12 to 16 hours a day, thanks in no small part to heavy pressure from Nintendo to produce a game that could be available by Thanksgiving 1994, making it a holiday game and allowing Super Nintendo to offer a game that Sega simply didn't have. The breakthrough game offered a slew of new features that other games did not. It was a platformer, replete with many of the standard tropes of the genre, including platforming over various obstacles. Of course, Rare did a lot more. There's climbing, tires, a vast array of enemies, secret levels, the ability to ride animals, absolutely stellar atmospheric music from David Weiss. Honestly, there's just so much. Of course, the heart and soul of the game are the characters, Donkey and Diddy Kong. Diddy Kong was clearly the replacement for Donkey Kong Jr., inserted because Rare initially tried to redesign Jr., only to have Nintendo simply request a new character or return it to the original design. Rare opted for the former, and Diddy was created. Donkey and Diddy came with their own movesets. Donkey is heavier and more solid, while Diddy is quicker and more agile. The game was earth-shattering. When he first saw the game, Minoru Arakawa, president of Nintendo of America, is said to have asked, quote, "The 64-bit games will look this good?" End quote. He thought the game was for the Nintendo 64, then codenamed the Ultra 64, and was apparently floored when he found out it was a Super Nintendo game. Aware that they had a hit on their hands, Nintendo invested $22 million in worldwide budgeting for the game, with more than $16 million going into America alone. That involved a variety of new techniques. Nintendo actually invested in the internet, launching a 3-month ad campaign on CompuServe. Anyone remember that? Which included a 1-hour live chat with Howard Lincoln, Minoru Arakawa, and Peter Main, then Executive Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Nintendo. It also included a massive ad campaign and the mailing of a video, Donkey Kong Country Exposed, to the subscribers of Nintendo Power. That video allowed viewers a behind-the-scenes look at the game, gave tips, and featured interviews with people involved with the game. The game, of course, was a monstrous hit. It was released on November 24th, 1994, the same day that Sega released their 32X, and in time for the 1994 holiday season. It promptly sold 500,000 copies in a week, setting the record for the fastest-selling video game of all time. By the time the 1994 holiday season was over, Donkey Kong sold 6 million copies and generated $400 million for Nintendo. It has since sold more than 9.3 million copies, making it the third best-selling game in Super Nintendo history, the best-selling non-Mario game in Super Nintendo history, and the best-selling Super Nintendo game not developed by Nintendo themselves. Only Super Mario World and Super Mario All-Stars sold better. More to the point, Donkey Kong also reversed Nintendo's fortunes. In 1991, 1992, and 1993, Nintendo had come in second during the holiday season, with Sega beating them in terms of sales. While that still happened at the end of 1994, it was clear that Donkey Kong had turned the tide in the console wars, and Nintendo would never look back to Sega again. Donkey Kong also proved that Nintendo could use its older hardware against the so-called newer and more technologically advanced systems like the 3DO and Atari Jaguar. Neither system ever really had a chance. A sequel was a foregone conclusion. In Donkey Kong Diddy Kong's Quest, you play as Diddy and Dixie Kong. The game continues its use of pre-rendered graphics, allowing you to play on 8 worlds and 52 levels. Dixie Kong marked a sharp difference between Donkey or Diddy, as you could use her ponytail to obtain limited floating powers. There are more animal friends, additional collectibles, including DK coins and Creme coins, and the Lost World, which offers a ton of new bonus content. Donkey Kong 2 offered more of a challenge than the original. While the original game was meant to be accessible and pull new players in, Donkey Kong 2 was explicitly designed with more experienced players in mind and meant to ensure that those who played the game had more of a challenge. Like its predecessor, Donkey Kong 2 was a massive hit. Stores couldn't keep copies of the game on their shelves for long enough, and the game wound up selling 5.1 million copies, making it the 6th best-selling game in Super Nintendo history. Once again, it was sequel time, but the Super Nintendo was running out of time. The Nintendo 64 was announced in November 1995, meaning that Super Nintendo's days were numbered. That would unquestionably limit the amount of time that Rare had to develop a game for the Super Nintendo. But Rare and Nintendo decided to proceed anyway, generating a new sequel as fast as possible. That game, Donkey Kong Country 3: Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, was released in November 1996, 2 months after the N64 came out. The new character in this game is Kiddy Kong, Dixie's cousin. As per the well-established formula, Kiddy comes with new abilities, including being able to bounce on water. There are new collectibles, like coins, that's with a K, and the standard upgrades in terms of worlds and gameplay. If there was any criticism of the game, it's that it was more the same. Even the iterations, the new characters, abilities, and worlds seemed a bit like a repeat of what you got in Donkey Kong Country 2, and some critics noted that the gameplay was repetitive. That didn't stop it from being a major hit, of course. 3.5 million copies were sold, making it the 11th best-selling game in Super Nintendo history. In total, this actually made Donkey Kong the second most successful franchise on the platform, behind only Mario. Around the same time, 3 Game Boy games were released. These 3 games, Donkey Kong Land 1, 2, and 3, were released in 1995, 1996, and 1997. All 3 games were developed by Rare, and all 3 managed to keep many aspects of the original games, including using a form of pre-rendered graphics. This enabled the games to obtain a degree of fidelity to the originals. As you would expect, all 3 Game Boy games roughly parallel the Donkey Kong versions. However, they are not ports, and while they use similar styles and gameplays, all 3 games have varying degrees of originality, with the first game being the most unique, the second game having the most similarities to its Super Nintendo version, and the third game being somewhere in between. Many of the developers and programmers, including the Stamper Brothers and composer David Weiss, worked on all 3 of these games. While Donkey Kong Land 1 was only available for the Game Boy, Donkey Kong Lands 2 and 3 were made available for the Super Game Boy, with a limited degree of color. All 3 games sold well. Donkey Kong Land moved 3.91 million units, Donkey Kong Land 2 sold 2.35 million units, and Donkey Kong Land 3 sold just north of a million. That made the games the 12th, 22nd, and 51st best-selling games on the Game Boy. The first Donkey Kong game for the Nintendo 64 was not Donkey Kong 64, but Diddy Kong Racing, a kart racing game that picked up on the success of Mario Kart and, well, went for it. This game actually had a really strange history. It started life as Wild Cartoon Kingdom before transitioning to Pro-Am 64, a sequel to RC Pro-Am, the classic Nintendo game also designed by Rare. However, Rare decided to make the game a Donkey Kong game as part of an effort to generate more sales and interest. To be clear, the game was more than just a Mario Kart clone. Players could choose one of 10 characters and use 3 vehicles, a car, hovercraft, or plane. Balloons could be used as power-ups, with different balloons having different impacts. There's also an adventure mode in which players collect balloons in order to advance through the story. Yes, the story. There's a plot, which includes racing against a boss character and the evil Whizpig. Wonder who thought of that one. Despite the fact that Donkey Kong was somewhat shoehorned into the game, it was a major hit. Critics praised its graphics and gameplay, noting it had achieved something truly difficult, replicating the kart style, without seeming like a clone of Mario Kart. 4.8 million copies were sold, and the game became the 8th best-selling in Nintendo 64 history. In 1997, Rare began work on the development of Donkey Kong 64, which would be the first full-fledged Donkey Kong game to enter the 3D era. The game was originally meant to be a linear game similar to the Donkey Kong Country series. However, another Rare property, Banjo-Kazooie, was a massive hit. As a result, Rare realized that they had to make the new Donkey Kong open-ended. Donkey Kong was originally meant to be very different than the final product, with some sources indicating that the game was set to premiere on the Nintendo 64 DD, an aborted add-on to the Nintendo 64. Others from Rare dispute those claims, so take it with a grain of salt. Furthermore, the game sold with the Expansion Pack, a mandatory RAM upgrade that made the game work with N64 systems. The pack allowed the game to show higher resolution graphics and a dynamic lighting system. The end result was a pretty major change from previous mainstream Donkey Kong titles. Donkey Kong 64 was open-ended and developed using the same game engine as Banjo-Kazooie. It's a platformer with a slew of puzzle elements featuring non-linear worlds, multiple playable characters, and collectibles. Yeah, the collectibles. There's no easy way to put this, but Donkey Kong 64 literally holds the Guinness World Record for most possible collectibles. There are 201 golden bananas, 3,500 colored bananas, 40 banana medals, 20 banana fairies, 40 blueprints, 8 boss keys, 10 battle crowns, 1 Nintendo coin, and 1 Rareware coin. Yeah, that's a lot. And it wasn't enjoyed by all players, with many reviews critically noting that the game felt like more of a scavenger hunt. Other less than kind playthroughs noted that the gameplay was way too close to resembling Banjo-Kazooie, and that there wasn't nearly enough differences between the two rare properties. That criticism is fair, but it's worth keeping in mind that the N64 was really new, and developers didn't have a lot of experience in creating games for the system. Despite these concerns, the game still did well. It sold 5.27 million copies, putting it 7th on the all-time list of N64 games, just in front of Diddy Kong Racing. Of course, what was unknown at the time was that this would be Rare's last original Donkey Kong game. That move would result in more delays, a severe shift in strategy for the popular franchise, and another piece of video game history that took a decidedly odd turn. But that's a story for another video. That's all for now, my friends, and as always, I hope you enjoyed what you had to see. If you are interested in seeing more videos on gaming history, please do like and subscribe, and please click on the next video that the almighty YouTube algorithm has selected for you to watch. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful day out there, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I like making it. Take care, everybody.